At its nearest point in its orbit around the Sun, Mars sits roughly 34 million miles from Earth. At that distance, a radio signal takes just over 3 minutes to make the crossing. At its farthest, when the two planets drift to opposite sides of the Sun, the gap swells to approximately 250 million miles, and a signal takes 22 minutes. Those numbers seem like a manageable inconvenience, until you start working through their actual consequences for a human crew. Because the delay is not just a communications nuisance. It is the physical expression of a distance so vast that it changes, in fundamental ways, what it means to be a human being on the far side of it. The cultural conversation about sending humans to Mars has been building for decades. Wernher von Braun published detailed engineering proposals for a Mars mission in the 1950s. NASA was studying crude Mars mission architectures in the 1960s. Even as Apollo was still flying, every decade since has produced new plans, new target dates, and new speeches declaring Mars the next great destination. The pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. A new administration arrives, announces Mars is the goal, sets a timeline, and then the timeline slips. The cycle begins again. What changed in the last 15 years or so is the scale of the expectation. SpaceX began developing its Starship vehicle, explicitly designed for Mars transit, with the stated goal of making humanity a multiplanetary species. NASA framed its Artemis program, the effort to return astronauts to the lunar surface, as a stepping stone toward Mars from the very beginning. The agency's own documentation describes a moon-to-Mars strategy built on a progressive pathway, with each mission building the technology and experience needed for an eventual crewed landing on Mars. As of early 2026, SpaceX had announced a delay of approximately 5 to 7 years in its Mars ambitions in order to focus on lunar objectives. But the long-term Mars goal remained intact. NASA continued to study crewed Mars mission architectures, targeting the late 2030s or early 2040s. Though no fully funded plan with a confirmed launch date yet existed, real engineers were solving real problems. Entry, descent, and landing technology for Mars was being tested. Life support systems, capable of operating for years rather than weeks, were being developed. The Perseverance rover was already demonstrating oxygen extraction from the Martian atmosphere, using an instrument called MOXIE, which successfully converted carbon dioxide into breathable oxygen. These are genuine steps towards sending humans to Mars. But genuine steps toward a destination, and actually arriving at that destination, are not the same thing. And more importantly, arriving at Mars and sustaining a meaningful human connection to Earth after arriving are not the same thing either. This is where the familiar narrative begins to fracture. The way the story is usually told places Mars inside a continuum of human achievement we already understand. Magellan circumnavigated the globe. Armstrong walked on the moon. Someday, someone will walk on Mars. The distances get longer, the technology gets better, but the emotional shape of the story stays the same. Heroes depart, heroes arrive, heroes return, and crowds celebrate. Mars is framed as a harder version of something we have already done, but the moon comparison, which is so deeply embedded in how we talk about Mars exploration, conceals a rupture that the comparison cannot survive. The moon sits approximately 239,000 miles from Earth. A radio signal covers that distance in about 1.25 seconds. When Neil Armstrong reported that the Eagle had landed, flight controllers in Houston heard his voice 1.25 seconds later. When a problem erupted aboard Apollo 13 in April of 1970, mission controllers saw the telemetry within seconds. The crew and the ground operated as a single integrated system, separated by a signal delay so small it was functionally imperceptible. Consider what happened during that mission in precise detail. At approximately 55 hours and 54 minutes into the flight, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. Jack Swigert keyed the microphone and reported the problem. 1.25 seconds later, the message reached Houston. Within minutes, the entire mission control team was working the emergency. Flight controllers could see the same instrument readings the crew was seeing in real time. They could catch errors the crew made, They could calculate new trajectories while the crew executed step-by-step procedures. The crew read values aloud. Houston confirmed them. When a visual check was needed, the answer came back in under 3 seconds. That real-time loop, that seamless collaboration between the people in the spacecraft and the hundreds of engineers in Houston, is what saved 3 lives. Not because the crew was incapable, but because no crew of 3 people can simultaneously diagnose cascading system failures, calculate new trajectories, write new procedures, and manage their own exhaustion and fear. The ground team provided the cognitive surplus the crew needed to survive. Houston was not just helpful, Houston was necessary. Now replay that same emergency on Mars. The explosion occurs. The commander reports it. The signal leaves the spacecraft at the speed of light. For the next 4 to 22 minutes, the crew is alone with the emergency. They cannot wait for Houston. Oxygen may be venting. Power may be failing. Pressure may be dropping. They must diagnose and begin responding immediately, based only on what they can see and what they already know. Their distress call reaches Earth sometime between 4 and 22 minutes after they sent it. Houston's response, carefully formulated from that point, takes another 4 to 22 minutes to arrive. By the time the crew hears back, between 8 and 44 minutes have passed. If the emergency is the kind that kills a person in 5 minutes, no one on Earth will know they were in trouble before it is already over. This is not an exaggeration. It is the physics of light-speed communication across interplanetary distances. It is not negotiable. It cannot be engineered away. The signal travels at the fastest speed the universe permits, and it still takes minutes or tens of minutes to cross the gap. No relay satellite system helps, because the delay is not caused by signal routing. It is caused by distance. You cannot make light faster. The consequences of this delay extend far beyond emergencies. They reshape the texture of every ordinary day. Imagine a crew member on Mars noticing that the day's schedule includes a maintenance task that no longer makes sense because a different system developed a minor issue overnight. They compose a message explaining the change and send it. The signal travels for 14 minutes, a typical one-way delay at many points in the mission. A flight controller at Johnson Space Center receives it, consults with a systems engineer, composes a response, and sends it back. 14 more minutes pass. The crew member receives the reply 28 minutes after sending the original message. On the International Space Station, that same exchange would take 30 seconds over radio. Now multiply that delay across every question, every request for clarification, every technical consultation, every psychological check-in, every routine decision that requires ground input, repeated across a mission, lasting roughly 1,000 days. The delay does not prevent communication. It transforms communication into something laborious and out of sync with how human beings naturally exchange information. Quick questions become half-hour exchanges. Complex discussions stretch across hours or days. The collaborative rhythm that makes mission control effective dissolves into a staccato pattern of time-shifted monologues. People respond to situations that have already changed. Advice arrives after the moment it was relevant has passed. Research on communication delay, conducted for NASA over more than 2 decades, has consistently found that increased latency produces frustration, miscommunication, reduced trust between teams, and degraded performance on collaborative tasks. A delay of just 5 seconds significantly impairs the ability of 2 groups to work together on a complex problem. At 50 seconds, collaborative problem-solving becomes nearly dysfunctional. Mars delays would not be 50 seconds. They would be hundreds of seconds, sometimes exceeding 1,300 seconds. A technical assessment published through the NASA Technical Report Server concluded that the operational paradigm used for every crewed mission since Project Mercury, a paradigm built on real-time ground support, functioning as the safety net for spaceflight, would face fundamental challenges during Mars missions. The assessment specifically noted that previous research links increased isolation and delayed communication to heighten stress, frustration, adverse behavioral symptoms, and reduced individual performance. Those findings came from controlled studies, where participants knew they were safe and knew the experiment would end. Imagine the same psychological effects compounding over months and years inside a habitat on Mars, where the isolation is not an experiment but the permanent condition of daily existence. On top of the delay, there is the blackout. Approximately every 26 months, Earth and Mars find themselves on opposite sides of the Sun, a configuration called solar conjunction. During this period, the Sun sits directly between the two planets, and its intense radio emissions disrupt or completely block communication. For roughly 2 to 3 weeks, a crew on Mars would have no reliable contact with Earth at all. No voice calls, no data transmissions, no telemetry, no emergency signals. Nothing gets through. NASA's own analysis confirms that all Mars missions with long surface days will experience at least one such blackout while the crew is on or near Mars. During every crewed mission in spaceflight history, from Mercury through the International Space Station, ground controllers have maintained continuous or near continuous communication with the crew. The psychological safety of knowing someone is listening, watching, and ready to help has been a foundational element of every human spaceflight ever flown. A Mars crew would experience weeks of complete silence at some point during the mission, arriving not at the beginning when morale is highest and the novelty of Mars still sustains the crew, but deep into the surface stay when the isolation has already become the background condition of daily life. Imagine a crew member developing symptoms suggesting a serious medical condition during that blackout. The medical officer examines the patient, prepares a detailed report, and attempts to send it to the flight surgeons on Earth. The signal cannot get through. The medical officer must make a diagnosis and treatment decision alone, without input from any of the thousands of physicians and specialists who have spent years preparing for exactly this kind of contingency. Whatever choice is made, it is made alone. The daily reality of a Mars habitat illustrates how comprehensively the crew depends on their own judgment and capability. The habitat must maintain breathable air by continuously scrubbing carbon dioxide, replenishing oxygen, managing humidity, filtering particulates including Martian dust tracked in from outside, monitoring for trace contaminant gases, and maintaining pressure within a narrow range compatible with human physiology. Each of those functions is performed by specific hardware: pumps, fans, chemical beds, electrolysis cells, sensors, valves, and controllers, all subject to wear and eventual failure. On the International Space Station, when the carbon dioxide removal system malfunctions, which it has done repeatedly, a spare can be delivered or a specialist procedure uploaded from the ground within weeks. On Mars, the spare parts inventory is fixed at mission start. Every component that might fail across 500 days on the surface must be anticipated, manufactured, tested, and launched from Earth years before the failure occurs. Anything not included in the inventory cannot be obtained. If a pump fails, and no spare pump exists on Mars, the crew must improvise with whatever materials they have on hand, or accept the degraded function and its downstream consequences. Water recovery illustrates the fragility particularly clearly. A crew of 4 people requires a minimum of roughly 2 liters of drinking water per person per day, plus additional water for food preparation and hygiene. Over 500 days, that exceeds 5,000 liters for 4 people. Launching that volume from Earth would be prohibitively expensive in mass. Instead, the habitat would rely on a closed-loop recycling system that recovers approximately 90% or more of all water used. That system must operate every single day for 500 days without a failure severe enough to drop its recovery rate below the threshold the crew needs. A 10% reduction in recovery efficiency sounds manageable in isolation, but compounded over 500 days, it produces a water deficit that could become life-threatening. Every breath, every drop of water, every hour of warmth inside the habitat depends on machinery continuing to function in an environment that is actively hostile to machinery. The crew would spend a significant portion of their working hours maintaining systems, replacing filters, calibrating sensors, repairing minor faults before they cascade into major failures. They would need to be capable of diagnosing and fixing complex mechanical and electronic systems, knowing that if something critical fails and they cannot repair it, the habitat stops being habitable. There is no backup plan. There is no resupply mission that can be improvised on any timeline relevant to a crisis. The logistics of Mars rescue are not merely difficult. They are effectively impossible on any timeline short of years. This impossibility is what transforms a technically round-trip mission into something psychologically more ambiguous. The crew knows from the moment they land that survival depends entirely on the systems they brought with them and their ability to maintain those systems without external support. Every meal comes from a finite stockpile. Every breath is recycled by equipment that cannot be replaced if it fails catastrophically. The margin for error on critical systems is essentially non-existent. The human body adds its own layer of accumulated vulnerability to the operational fragility of the hardware. On Earth, bones continuously remodel themselves in response to the mechanical loading imposed by gravity. Remove that gravitational signal, and the process breaks. Bone resorption accelerates, bone formation slows, and bone mineral density begins to decline. NASA has measured that loss at approximately 1 to 1.5% per month during spaceflight. A crew member spending 9 months in microgravity during the transit to Mars alone could lose between 9 and 13% of their bone mineral density before even reaching the Martian surface. Mars gravity, at 38% of Earth's, would slow, but likely not halt the loss. No human has ever lived in fractional gravity for an extended period, so current research cannot confirm whether Mars gravity is sufficient to maintain bone homeostasis. NASA's own risk assessments acknowledge that essentially nothing is known about how the fractional gravity environment on Mars might influence the progression of microgravity-induced bone loss over time. The crew would be running an experiment with their own skeletons as the test subjects. After 500 days on Mars, and another 9 months of microgravity on the return trip, the cumulative bone loss could be severe. Even with rigorous daily exercise, which International Space Station astronauts perform for 2 hours every day, post-flight bone recovery in returning astronauts is incomplete. Studies have shown that some crew members do not fully recover their pre-flight bone density even a year after returning to Earth. Muscles follow a similar trajectory. Without continuous loading against gravity, muscle fibers shrink and strength decreases. Even the exercise protocols used on the station leave astronauts with measurable losses in muscle mass and functional capacity. Whether the fitness standards required for a Mars mission can actually be maintained over 2.5 years with limited exercise equipment remains unproven. The cardiovascular system adapts in microgravity by becoming smaller and less efficient, since it no longer needs to pump blood upward against gravitational force. Blood volume decreases. The body's ability to regulate blood pressure upon standing, a reflex called orthostatic tolerance, deteriorates significantly. Astronauts returning from 6 months on the station frequently cannot stand without feeling faint and require assistance to walk for the first days after landing. After 2.5 years of reduced gravity, the deconditioning would be far more severe. And unlike a crew returning from the station who steps into the arms of a waiting medical team, the Mars crew would not be landing near any hospital. They would be re-entering Earth's atmosphere at approximately 25,000 miles per hour after a 9-month return transit. With bodies that may struggle to tolerate the deceleration forces of re-entry, the most insidious physiological threat is one that exercise cannot address at all: radiation. Outside the protective embrace of Earth's magnetosphere, the crew would be exposed continuously to 2 distinct sources of space radiation. Solar energetic particles, high-energy protons released during solar flares and coronal mass ejections, can deliver dangerous doses within minutes and are inherently unpredictable. Galactic cosmic rays, extremely high-energy particles originating outside the solar system, are so penetrating that they pass through spacecraft walls, through equipment, and through the bodies of the crew with minimal attenuation. NASA's own documentation acknowledges that shielding against galactic cosmic rays is only marginally effective at reasonable thicknesses, and that increasing shielding mass provides diminishing protection. Some shielding materials actually worsen the problem by generating secondary radiation when cosmic ray particles strike atomic nuclei in the shield and produce additional particles. Radiation damages DNA, causes chromosomal aberrations in immune system cells, increases the risk of cataracts and cardiovascular disease, and has been linked to potential cognitive decline. Animal studies have documented behavioral changes, impaired memory, and increased anxiety in animals exposed to space-relevant radiation doses. Analysis of data collected by the Curiosity rover's radiation detector during its transit to Mars in 2012 confirmed that a crewed Mars mission using current propulsion technology would expose the crew to radiation levels, raising their lifetime cancer risk by several %. NASA has estimated that its permissible exposure limits would constrain long-duration deep space missions to roughly 150 to 250 days. A Mars mission requires 400 to 600 days in deep space, not counting surface time, during which the crew would receive additional radiation exposure because Mars lacks a global magnetic field and its thin atmosphere offers only modest shielding. These physiological threats interact with each other in ways that make the compound risk greater than the sum of the individual parts. Bone loss increases fracture risk. Muscle atrophy reduces the ability to perform physical maintenance tasks. Cardiovascular deconditioning limits exercise capacity, which is itself the primary countermeasure against bone and muscle loss. Radiation degrades the immune system, making the crew more vulnerable to infections that their weakened bodies would be less equipped to fight. Each system's deterioration accelerates the others. The body does not fail in a single dramatic collapse. It erodes steadily across multiple systems simultaneously, and the erosion continues for the full duration of the mission. Layer the operational fragility on top of the physiological vulnerability, and the picture that emerges is not of a grand adventure with a reliable return leg, but of a chain of distinct operations, each of which must succeed under conditions that are actively hostile to success. Launch from Earth. 9 months of interplanetary transit. Mars orbital insertion. Powered descent and landing. 500 days of surface operations. Ascent from Mars to orbit. Rendezvous with the Earth return vehicle. 9 months of return transit. Re-entry and landing. Each link in that chain carries risk. Each depends on hardware that has been exposed to vacuum, radiation, thermal cycling, and micrometeorite bombardment for years. The Mars Ascent Vehicle deserves particular attention because it is the single most critical piece of hardware in the entire mission. On Earth, rockets are maintained by large teams of engineers right up to launch. Anomalies are found and corrected during final inspections. Valves are tested. Avionics are verified. The vehicle sits in a controlled, temperature-regulated environment. Even so, launch delays are common. The Mars Ascent Vehicle, by contrast, would be launched from Earth, travel for 9 months through interplanetary space, land on, or be prepositioned on, Mars, and then sit on the surface for approximately 500 days before the crew needs it. During those 500 days, it would be exposed to temperatures swinging between approximately -100 degrees Celsius at night and occasionally above freezing during the warmest daytime conditions, with that thermal cycling repeating every single Martian day. It would be coated by fine-grained, electrostatically charged Martian dust that could accumulate in thruster nozzles and on sensor ports. Some of that dust contains perchlorates, chemically reactive compounds that can corrode certain materials over extended exposure. The crew would need to clean and inspect the ascent vehicle manually, in pressure suits, using limited tools, before launch. And when the launch moment arrives, there is no mission control team standing by to scrub the countdown if an anomaly is detected. There is no pad crew to inspect the vehicle. There is no option to try again tomorrow. The crew presses the button, and the engine either ignites or it does not. If it does not ignite, or if it ignites but underperforms, or if the guidance system malfunctions during ascent, or if the rendezvous with the return vehicle fails, the crew has no recourse. No second ascent vehicle sits waiting on the surface. No orbital asset can retrieve them. The crew remains on Mars, with consumables provisioned for 500 days, facing a wait of approximately 26 more months until the next transfer window might allow a resupply mission to be dispatched. The engineers working on Mars mission architectures are not naive about these risks. They are among the most talented professionals in the world, and they are earnestly working to mitigate every threat they can identify. Better exercise protocols, improved radiation shielding concepts, autonomous medical diagnostic systems, redundant life support components. Each mitigation reduces risk by some increment, but none eliminates it. And the irreducible residual risk that remains after every countermeasure has been applied is higher for a Mars mission than for any crewed spaceflight ever attempted. This residual risk is what transforms the mission architecture from a round trip into something that exists in an ambiguous space between going and not fully coming back. On February 14th, 1990, from a distance of approximately 3.7 billion miles, the Voyager 1 spacecraft turned its camera back toward the inner solar system and took a photograph. In that image, Earth appears as a pale blue dot, less than a single pixel wide, suspended in a ray of scattered sunlight. Carl Sagan requested that photograph. He wanted humanity to see itself from far away. The image is haunting not because it shows Earth as small, but because it shows Earth as something that could be mistaken for a camera artifact or a speck of dust on the lens. A fleck of light that means nothing unless you already know what it is. The first humans on Mars would not be 3.7 billion miles away. At its closest approach, they would be approximately 34 million miles from Earth. At its farthest during the surface stay, perhaps 250 million miles. But from the Martian surface, Earth would appear as a bright point of light in the pre-dawn or post-sunset sky. Not a world, not a blue marble, a dot brighter than most stars, but small enough to cover completely with the tip of your smallest finger held at arm's length. Every person you have ever known, every place you have ever been, every piece of music ever composed, every war ever fought, everything that has ever mattered to the human species fits behind your fingernail. Astronauts who have orbited Earth describe a phenomenon called the overview effect. Seeing the planet from space, they report a cognitive shift, a sudden visceral understanding of Earth's fragility and of the interconnectedness of all life on its surface. The overview effect is powerful, partly because the astronaut can still see Earth as a world. Continents are visible. Oceans are unmistakably blue. City lights shimmer on the night side. The planet is close enough to feel present, alive, recognizably home. From Mars, there would be no overview effect. There would be something else entirely, something no astronaut has ever experienced and no psychologist yet has a name for. The sight of Earth as a point of light, too small to show any detail. No continents, no oceans, no evidence of life. Just a coordinate in a dark sky, indistinguishable from any other star except by its position and its brightness. This visual severing may seem like a small thing compared to the physiological and operational challenges already described. It is not. Human beings orient themselves emotionally through sensory connection to familiar environments. The sight of familiar landscapes, the sound of familiar voices, the physical presence of familiar people are not luxuries. They are foundational to psychological stability. When all of them are removed simultaneously and replaced by an alien landscape, an alien sky, and a knowledge that everyone you care about has been reduced to a point of light you can blot out with your thumb, something fundamental changes in how you experience your own existence. The temporal disconnection compounds the sensory one. On Earth, human beings inhabit a shared present. When something happens, news of it spreads across the globe within seconds. You can call someone on the other side of the planet and hear their voice in real time. The entire human species, for all its divisions, experiences time together. Events happen and become known about simultaneously by everyone who is paying attention. This shared present is so fundamental to how civilization functions that most people never notice it. It is the invisible medium through which culture, politics, commerce, relationships, and daily life all flow. A Mars crew would be excluded from that shared present. Their present would be offset from Earth's by 3 to 22 minutes. They cannot participate in a live broadcast. They cannot join a real-time video call. They cannot watch breaking news as it breaks, or share a meal over a screen with a family member in anything resembling genuine simultaneity. They would exist in a parallel timeline, close enough to know what Earth is doing, but too far removed to do it with anyone there. Over time, this temporal exile produces a psychological effect that is subtle but profound. The crew begins to feel like observers of Earth rather than participants in it. They receive updates the way a historian reads dispatches from the past. Informed, but uninvolved. A birthday greeting arrives 14 minutes after the birthday moment has passed. An expression of worry reaches the crew 20 minutes after the crisis that prompted it has already been resolved or worsened. A declaration of love hangs in the void for 11 minutes before the person it was meant for even knows it was spoken. Each of those small disconnections is individually survivable. People endure worse separations every day. But the Mars crew would experience all of them simultaneously, continuously, for years. The cumulative effect is not a single dramatic rupture. It is a slow dissolution. The bonds connecting the crew to Earth do not snap. They stretch, they thin, they become translucent, and at some point, perhaps impossible to identify precisely, those bonds stop functioning as bonds and become something more like memories of bonds, echoes of a connection that used to be alive. This is not speculation. It is a pattern documented in far less extreme forms of separation. Military families, long-distance relationships, and expatriate communities all report that sustained separation, even with modern communication technology, gradually changes the quality of emotional connection. People adapt to absence. They build new routines that do not include the absent person. They form new relationships and develop habits shaped by who is present rather than who is missing. The absent person becomes a beloved idea rather than a lived reality. By the time the Mars crew returns to Earth, the people they left behind will have adapted to their absence. Not cruelly, not deliberately, simply naturally, because that is how human beings work. People live forward, not in stasis. Children go to school, partners go to work. Birthdays are celebrated with the people who are present, not with the people who are a delayed video message away. The family does not forget the crew member on Mars, but they build a life that functions without that person, because the alternative is to spend 3 years in suspended animation waiting for someone to come back. The crew would undergo a parallel process. The mission demands their full attention. Functioning on Mars requires that they invest emotionally in where they are rather than where they were. Every unit of emotional energy directed toward Mars life is a unit withdrawn from Earth life. The crew does not decide to let go of Earth. They simply run out of the capacity to hold on to it, while also doing the work that keeps them alive. By the time the launch window for the return opens, approximately 500 days into the surface stay, the crew may be more emotionally attached to the world they are on than the world they came from. Not because Mars is better than Earth, but because Mars is present and Earth has become abstract. You live where you live. You bond with the people you see. You find meaning in the work immediately in front of you. After 500 days, all of that is on Mars. Even if the mission goes exactly as planned and the crew physically returns, they return to a world that has been moving forward without them. Children will have grown, friends will have moved, technologies will have changed. The cultural conversations that define the year they left will have been replaced by entirely different ones. The crew would carry memories of Martian sunrises, of dust storms that turned the sky amber, of the sound of their own breathing inside a helmet on a world where no one else has ever breathed. Those experiences are unintelligible to anyone who was not there. And the experiences that everyone on Earth accumulated during their absence, the elections, the crises, the cultural shifts, the personal milestones, are equally unintelligible to them. This mutual unintelligibility is what makes the separation functionally permanent, regardless of whether the crew physically returns. You can bring a person back to a place. You cannot bring them back to a time. The Earth the crew departed no longer exists. The people they were when they left no longer exist. The relationships they maintained through delayed messages across millions of miles are not the same relationships they would have maintained through daily presence. Everyone involved has become someone slightly different, shaped by experiences the other side cannot fully share. The crew does not return to their old lives. They arrive at new lives that happen to be located where their old lives used to be. There is a particular dimension to this that distinguishes it from ordinary human separation. When a soldier deploys overseas, they miss months of their family's life, but they share the same planet. They watch the same moon rise. They can call home and hear a voice without any delay. They know with certainty that if something catastrophic happens, they can be brought home. The separation is painful, but it is bounded. It exists within the framework of normal human experience. A Mars crew would have none of those anchors. Their separation would be unbounded in the sense that no emergency recall is possible. Open-ended in the sense that the return depends on orbital mechanics and system survival, not human decision. Sensory in the sense that they cannot see, hear, or feel Earth in any meaningful way, and temporal in the sense that their experience of time itself diverges from Earth's through the communication delay. In every dimension of human connection, they would be further from home than any person has ever been. And the further they get from home in those dimensions, the more the word home itself changes its meaning. Mars would gradually become the primary reality, not Earth. Not the place they came from, but the place they are, the habitat they live in, the landscape they walk across, the people they share meals with, the routines they follow, the problems they solve. Human beings are extraordinarily adaptive. Given enough time, we normalize almost any environment. The crew would normalize Mars. They would develop rhythms suited to Martian days. They would learn the patterns of Martian weather. They would find satisfaction in the work of survival and exploration. They would create a microculture, a tiny civilization of 4 to 6 people, with its own shared language, its own inside references, its own unspoken rules. And as that Martian life solidified, the Earth life they left behind would recede, not disappear, not be forgotten, but recede, become something they think about with love and some grief, but decreasing urgency as the months turn into years. This psychological adaptation is not a failure. It is a survival mechanism. The crew cannot afford to spend their days grieving for Earth. They have work to do and each other to support. The mission demands their full presence, and giving it requires investing emotionally in where they are rather than where they were. The historical significance of this moment is rarely framed in its full complexity. The first footsteps on Mars are described as the next great achievement in human exploration, a triumph of engineering and courage, a milestone in our expansion into the solar system. They would be all of those things. But they would also be the first moment in human history when members of our species voluntarily crossed a threshold of separation that is, in a meaningful sense, not fully reversible. Not because the crew cannot physically return, but because the act of going, of spending years on the far side of that wall of light minutes, changes them and changes their relationship to Earth in ways that no return trip can undo. Every previous frontier in human history has eventually been integrated into the fabric of ordinary life. The Americas were remote until they were not. Australia was isolated until it was not. Even Antarctica, the most inaccessible continent on Earth, is now serviced by regular flights and maintains real-time communication with the rest of the world. Those frontiers were absorbed into the human sphere. Mars will not be absorbed, not in the first generation, not with the first crew. The distance is too great. The communication delay is too long. The travel time is too vast. Mars will remain outside the human sphere for decades, perhaps centuries after the first landing. The crew who goes there will not be pioneers settling a new territory within the human world. They will be emissaries crossing out of the human world into something that does not yet have a name. The terror lurking beneath the triumphant narrative is not the risk of death, though that risk is real and substantial. Astronauts accept the possibility of death when they join any space program. They understand that spaceflight is dangerous. They make peace with that danger through training and preparation and belief in the mission's importance. The unspoken terror is the risk of something different. The risk of living on Mars long enough that Earth stops being home. The risk of coming back and discovering that you no longer quite fit into the world you came from. The risk of standing on a planet 200 million miles away and realizing that the people you love are becoming memories, that the life you plan to return to is slowly dissolving in the time lag between your messages, and that you are, imperceptibly and irreversibly, becoming someone who belongs to Mars more than to Earth. That is what the title of this topic really means. The first humans on Mars would never see Earth again, not because they would necessarily die there, and not because no return vehicle would be built, but because the Earth they knew, the Earth they left, the Earth that existed in their memories and in their hearts during every minute of every day they spent 140 million miles away, would be gone by the time they got back. The Earth they would return to is a different Earth. The people on it are different people. The crew themselves are different people. The reunion would be real. The return would be real. But the homecoming in the deepest human sense of that word would be something more complicated. You cannot come home to a moment. You can only come home to a place, and the place would not be the same. There is no engineering solution to this. There is no mission architecture that prevents it. There is no training protocol or psychological preparation program that exempts a human being from the consequences of 3 years of profound isolation at interplanetary distances. The distance would not kill them. It would simply, gradually, convert them into people for whom Earth is no longer the place they live, but the place they remember. What makes the Mars Challenge scientifically fascinating is that researchers are now attempting to understand and quantify these effects in ways that were never necessary before. The Human Research Program at NASA has identified 32 distinct space-related health risks requiring study for prevention and mitigation. Behavioral health and performance research is ongoing, examining what happens to small groups in isolated, confined environments over extended durations. Studies of Antarctic overwinter crews who spend months in polar darkness with limited outside contact document measurable changes in cognitive function, mood, interpersonal relationships, and what researchers call the third quarter phenomenon, a reliable dip in morale and motivation that occurs roughly 3/4 of the way through an isolated assignment. A Mars mission would last far longer than any Antarctic winter, and its communication constraints would be incomparably more severe. Researchers are also working on countermeasures for the physiological threats, pharmaceutical interventions to slow bone loss, exercise equipment optimized for mass and volume constraints while maximizing effectiveness, radiation shielding materials and mission planning strategies designed to minimize exposure during solar energetic particle events, autonomous medical diagnostic systems capable of supporting the crew's medical officer with decision-making in the absence of real-time ground consultation, psychological support frameworks designed for asynchronous communication, acknowledging that a therapist whose response arrives 14 minutes after the session began is not a therapist in any conventional sense. Each of these research threads represents a genuine scientific effort to make a Mars mission more survivable. And the questions being asked are producing insights that matter far beyond the specific goal of reaching Mars. The science of how human physiology degrades in space radiation environments and how it can be protected is directly relevant to long-term human presence anywhere beyond Earth's magnetosphere. The science of how small groups function under extreme isolation and communication constraints has applications for any organization managing teams in remote or high-stakes environments. The medical autonomy requirements of a Mars mission are driving advances in robotic surgery, autonomous diagnostic systems, and remote medical guidance that will eventually reach ordinary medicine. But the scientific progress as real and important as it is, has not yet solved the fundamental problem. Radiation exposure limits still constrain how long human beings can safely spend in deep space. Bone loss countermeasures still leave returning astronauts with measurable deficits after 6 months. The communication delay is governed by the speed of light, which is not an engineering variable. And the psychological consequences of years of isolation at interplanetary distances have not been studied in conditions remotely approaching those of an actual Mars mission. The candid reality is that the first humans to land on Mars would be doing so in a condition of irreducible uncertainty. Uncertainty about whether their bodies would withstand the physiological demands of the full mission. Uncertainty about whether every link in the operational chain would hold. Uncertainty about whether the ascent vehicle that was supposed to bring them home had survived 500 days on the Martian surface in working condition. Uncertainty about what they would find waiting for them if they made it back, both in the external world and inside themselves. The scientists and engineers studying these questions do not pretend the uncertainties are small. They are working on them precisely because they are not small. What they have produced, across decades of research and robotic exploration and analog studies and physiological investigation, is a much clearer picture of exactly how hard a Mars mission would be, and exactly what it would cost the human beings who attempted it. That clarity is not a reason to abandon the goal. It is a reason to take the goal seriously, to understand it honestly, and to resist the comfortable illusion that Mars is simply a longer version of something we have already done. The first footstep on Mars will be one of the most significant events in the history of our species. It will represent decades of work by thousands of people. It will demonstrate capabilities that seemed impossibly distant when the first Mars mission proposals were drawn up in the 1950s. It will open a genuinely new chapter in human existence, and it will cost something that no mission plan fully accounts for. Not in dollars or engineering hours or rocket fuel, but in the quiet, accumulating, irreversible currency of human connection. The crew who takes that first step will have crossed a distance measured not only in miles, but in minutes of silence, in weeks of blackout, in years of isolation, in the slow transformation of the word home from a description of a place to a description of something that exists only in memory. The Earth they see through a telescope on a Martian evening is not their Earth. It is a dot of light carrying the faintest echo of a world they used to inhabit. The voices they hear in their communication systems, arriving 11 or 14 or 22 minutes after the words were spoken, are not the voices of people they are talking to. They are the voices of people talking to them in a past that has already ended by the time it arrives. The love they feel for the people back home is real, but it is a love sustained by memory rather than presence, by imagination rather than experience. The first humans on Mars would carry Earth inside them, in their DNA, in their memories, in the language they speak, and the food they miss, and the songs they hum during long Martian nights. They would never fully leave Earth behind in the sense of forgetting it, or ceasing to care about it, but they would leave it behind in the sense that matters most. They would leave behind the experience of living on Earth, the experience of being embedded in its daily life, the experience of being present with the people they love in real time, without delay, without the vast, indifferent silence of interplanetary space stretching between every word. And when they look up at the Martian sky and find the pale blue dot that is Earth, barely visible among the stars, they would understand something that no human being has ever understood before. That home is not always a place you can return to in any complete sense. That distance is not just a measure of miles. That the first step on Mars, the step that will be celebrated as one of humanity's greatest achievements, is also a step that carries a human being further from home than anyone has ever gone, not just in space. In every dimension of human experience, that gives the word home its meaning. The research on how to make that journey less costly continues. Scientists are working on faster propulsion systems that would reduce transit time, and therefore radiation exposure and physiological deterioration. Artificial gravity through rotation is being studied as a way to mitigate bone and muscle loss during transit. Advanced biomedical monitoring systems are being developed to give the crew better information about their own health status. Communication technology improvements are being explored for the conjunction blackout periods, including relay satellite systems positioned to maintain some signal path even when the direct Earth-Mars route is blocked. These efforts are real and they matter. Faster transit, better shielding, maintained bone density, reduced communication blackout periods. Each improvement makes the mission more survivable and the separation less total. But they cannot change the fundamental arithmetic of distance. At any achievable propulsion level, Mars will be months away. The communication delay will remain measured in minutes. The separation will remain unlike anything in the prior history of human exploration. The question the first Mars crew will answer, not in a press conference and not in a published paper, but in the daily reality of their 1,000 days, is what it actually costs a human being to cross that particular distance. What it does to a person's relationship with everyone they have ever known. What it does to the concept of home when home is a bright dot in an alien sky. What it does to the meaning of connection when every attempt to connect arrives as a message from the past. Those answers will shape everything that comes after. How we think about permanent settlements on Mars. How we think about the psychological selection and preparation of crews. How we think about maintaining bonds between Earth and Mars colonies as the distance becomes a permanent feature of human civilization, rather than a temporary condition of a single mission. The science of getting to Mars has been advancing for decades. The science of what Mars does to the people who go there is just beginning. And the most important experiments in that science cannot be run in a laboratory or an Antarctic station or an isolation facility. They can only be run by the actual people who make the actual journey. The first humans on Mars will not just be explorers and scientists and engineers. They will be the first data points in a study with no analog and no precedent. A study of what happens to a human being who crosses, willingly and knowingly, further from home than anyone has ever gone. There is a particular kind of cultural blindness that surrounds the Mars conversation, and it is worth understanding precisely because it shapes so much of how the mission is discussed. The blindness is not ignorance. The scientists and engineers working on Mars mission architectures know exactly how difficult the journey is. The blindness is instead a kind of narrative selection, a tendency to foreground the engineering challenges while backgrounding the human ones, to celebrate the technical milestones while treating the psychological costs as a footnote rather than a central theme. Part of this is understandable. The engineering challenges are concrete and measurable. You can point to a rocket engine test and say, "This is progress." You can run a life support simulation and measure how long it sustains a crew. You can test radiation shielding and quantify how much it attenuates a dose. These are the kinds of achievements that fit comfortably into press releases and documentary footage. They produce images. They generate excitement. The human costs of a Mars mission are harder to visualize. The slow erosion of a bond between a crew member and their family across 3 years of delayed communication does not make for a compelling photograph. The gradual psychological adaptation that causes a person to feel more at home on Mars than on Earth does not register on an instrument panel. The transformation of home from a lived reality to a memory does not generate a headline. So these costs remain in the background of the conversation, acknowledged in passing if at all, while the engineering progress moves to the front. This narrative imbalance matters because it shapes public understanding of what the mission actually involves, and it shapes the expectations of the people who might volunteer for it. A person who understands Mars as a longer and harder version of Apollo is preparing for a fundamentally different experience than a person who understands Mars as a threshold beyond which the normal human anchors of connection, support, and home do not function in their usual ways. The Apollo comparison is worth examining in one more specific dimension: the duration. Apollo missions lasted roughly a week. The longest was Apollo 17, at just over 12 days. The crew was never gone long enough for their families to fully adapt to their absence. They were never gone long enough for significant world events to occur without them. They were never gone long enough for the physical deterioration of their bodies to become a serious concern. They were never gone long enough for their connection to the people they loved to begin thinning into correspondence. A Mars mission would last approximately 2.5 to 3 years. That is not a scaled-up Apollo mission in duration. It is not 5 times longer or 10 times longer. It is a fundamentally different category of absence. There are entire stages of childhood development that can occur during a 3-year gap. There are careers that change significantly over 3 years. There are health crises, family ruptures, financial transformations, and cultural shifts that can occur in 3 years. 3 years is long enough for a child to go from 7 to 10, which is a transformation so complete that the child who greets a returning crew member is in some meaningful sense not the same child who said goodbye at the launch. The Apollo astronauts came home to families that had been waiting for them for a week. The Mars crew would come home to families that had been building a life without them for 3 years. The homecoming would be genuine, and the love would be genuine. But the world the crew returned to would be unrecognizable in dozens of quiet ways that no one prepared either side for. This 3-year gap also matters in terms of career. The crew members who go to Mars would be among the most talented and accomplished people in whatever fields they represent. Physicians, engineers, geologists, biologists, pilots. They would leave Earth at or near the peak of their professional capacities. They would return 3 years later, having spent that time doing extraordinary things, but in a context entirely separated from the normal trajectories of their fields. The research landscape, the technical standards, the institutional relationships, the ongoing projects they were part of, all of it would have continued evolving without them. Returning to professional life after 3 years of Mars would not be like returning from a sabbatical. It would be something more disorienting, more comprehensive, and the physical condition the crew would return in would compound all of this. Years of reduced gravity, radiation exposure, and the physiological strain of the mission would leave the crew in weaker physical condition than they departed. Rehabilitation would take months. The cognitive and psychological adjustment to returning to Earth after years of Martian routines and Martian autonomy would take additional time. The crew would arrive at a world that had been moving forward for 3 years, in bodies that had been moving backward for most of that same period. None of this is an argument against the mission. The astronauts who would volunteer for a Mars mission would understand these costs, or they should understand them, and they would be making a conscious choice to accept them. That choice deserves respect. It also deserves honesty. The full weight of what is being asked and what is being given up should be part of the conversation, not confined to the fine print. Understanding the isolation, in more concrete terms, requires thinking about what ordinary human communication actually does for us. Most people communicate with family members, close friends, and colleagues every day. These interactions are not primarily about exchanging information. They are about maintaining connection. A brief conversation with a friend over lunch is not valuable because of the information it contains. It is valuable because of the experience of being in contact with another person who knows you, cares about you, and shares your immediate moment. A phone call to a parent is not a data transfer. It is a maintenance operation on a relationship that requires regular presence to stay alive. All of that daily maintenance depends on the immediacy of real-time communication. You say something, you see the other person's face respond, you adjust, they respond, and through that exchange, the relationship stays current. Each person knows where the other is emotionally. Misunderstandings get caught and corrected in real time. Affection gets expressed and received in the moment it is felt. The relationship stays synchronized. The communication delay of a Mars mission breaks every element of that synchronization. You cannot see the other person's face respond to your words because, by the time your words arrive, you have already moved on from the moment that generated them. You cannot correct a misunderstanding in real time because by the time your clarification arrives, the other person has already formed an impression based on the original message. You cannot share a moment of silence with someone you love because any silence you share is divided by 11 or 14 or 22 minutes of actual time during which both of you have continued living separately. What you can do is exchange monologues. You record a message, you send it, it arrives, the other person records a reply, it travels, it arrives. The exchange resembles correspondence more than conversation. It resembles writing a thoughtful letter and receiving a thoughtful letter in reply. That is not nothing. It can sustain a meaningful connection over time, especially when both parties are committed to maintaining it. But it is a fundamentally impoverished form of human contact compared to what both parties had before departure. And the impoverishment is not merely inconvenient. It has measurable consequences for psychological health and for the stability of the relationship. Research on long-distance relationships consistently shows that they require substantially more conscious effort to maintain than co-located relationships, that they produce higher levels of loneliness and relationship dissatisfaction over time, even when both partners are highly committed, and that they are significantly more vulnerable to dissolution when external stressors or life changes occur because the couple cannot navigate those changes together in real time. A Mars crew member and their partner on Earth would be in a long-distance relationship with the most severe communication constraints of any long-distance relationship in human history, maintained across the most extreme physical separation in human history. For longer than most long-distance relationships typically last before they reach a resolution one way or another. The crew members themselves would have each other. That small group of 4 to 6 people would be the entire social world of each individual member for the full duration of the mission. In terms of human presence, they would have everything they need. In terms of human diversity, the breadth of personality types, perspectives, backgrounds, and emotional registers that ordinarily enriches a person's social life, they would have only what that small group could provide. Research on small group dynamics in isolated and confined environments shows that the social landscape narrows over time in ways that create new pressures, even as it provides the essential support the crew needs to function. Irritations that would be trivial in a normal social environment, a specific way someone chews their food, a habit of whistling while working, a tendency to dominate conversations, become magnified when the same small group shares a confined space for years with no possibility of relief. Personality differences that were manageable in the short term, when the group was selected and training together in a large organization with many social resources, can become sources of genuine friction over the course of a mission. The psychological research literature on Antarctic overwinter crews and submarine deployments documents these dynamics extensively and consistently. On the International Space Station, crew rotations every 6 months refresh the social environment. New people arrive with new energy, new perspectives, and new social dynamics. People who have built up friction with each other leave before that friction becomes destructive. The station is never occupied by the same crew for more than 6 months at a time, which is not a coincidence. It is partly an acknowledgement of the psychological research on what prolonged confinement with a fixed small group does to interpersonal relationships. A Mars mission would have no crew rotations, no new arrivals, no departures, the same faces for 1,000 days. When interpersonal tension develops between crew members, as it inevitably would at some point over 3 years, there is no manager to mediate, no counselor to bring in, no option to separate the conflicting parties for a few days while tensions cool. There is only the habitat, the mission, and the requirement to keep functioning as a team in conditions where failure to do so has potentially fatal consequences. Mission planners are aware of this. Crew selection processes for Mars missions would screen heavily for psychological compatibility, conflict resolution skills, and the ability to function under prolonged stress. The training would include simulated mission scenarios designed to reveal how candidates respond under pressure and how they interact with each other over extended periods. Analog missions like the High Seas studies in Hawaii and the Mars 500 simulation in Moscow have attempted to test and refine these selection criteria. The Mars 500 study, which ran from 2010 to 2011, confined 6 volunteers for 520 days in a habitat designed to simulate an interplanetary mission to Mars. The results were informative. Participants experienced sleep disruption, reduced physical activity, and what researchers described as a sedentary and monotonous daily routine that bore limited resemblance to the cognitive and physical demands of an actual Mars mission. The study confirmed that prolonged isolation in a small group is manageable. It also revealed that the conditions of the simulation were insufficient to model the actual psychological demands of a real Mars mission, which would involve genuine mortal risk, genuine communication delay, genuine physical deterioration, and genuine irreversibility. Simulations can tell us some things. They cannot tell us what it feels like to know that you cannot go home. There is also the question of what the crew would actually do for 500 days on the surface of Mars, beyond the immediate work of survival. The scientific agenda of a Mars surface mission would be extraordinarily rich. Mars preserves a geological record stretching back billions of years. Its rocks contain information about the early solar system, about the conditions under which it was potentially habitable, and about what processes transformed it from a world with liquid water and a thicker atmosphere into the cold desert it is today. The detection of biosignatures, evidence of past or even present microbial life, would be among the most significant scientific discoveries in human history. A crewed mission could conduct fieldwork across a range of sites with a sophistication and flexibility impossible for robots, exercising scientific judgment in real time, following unexpected findings, and adapting their investigation to what they discover. But 500 days is a long time to fill, even with a rich scientific agenda, and the physical constraints of working in a pressure suit on a hostile surface impose limits on how much fieldwork the crew can safely conduct per day. The remaining time must be structured, meaningful, and psychologically sustainable. How do you maintain motivation and purpose across 500 days of repetitive systems maintenance, limited social interaction, and gradual physical deterioration, knowing that every day you spend on the surface is another day of accumulated risk between you and the return window? The psychological support systems for a Mars crew would need to be substantially more sophisticated than anything used on previous missions. Scheduled communication sessions with psychologists, though necessarily asynchronous, comprehensive media libraries, educational resources, creative tools, structured recreation options, work that provides genuine intellectual challenge and a sense of accomplishment. These are not luxuries in a Mars context. They are functional necessities, as important to the success of the mission as the water recycling system. The crew would also need, perhaps more than anything else, a clear and genuine sense of the mission's importance, not as an abstraction or a slogan, but as a felt reality that sustains motivation across the full duration of the surface stay. The knowledge that what they are doing matters, that the data they are gathering will be analyzed for decades, that their survival and success will shape how humanity thinks about its future beyond Earth, is a psychological resource that the crew would need to draw on repeatedly over 500 days of difficulty and uncertainty. Whether that sense of mission purpose is sufficient to sustain a crew through 3 years of accumulated hardship is one of the questions that cannot be answered until the mission actually happens. The analog studies suggest that a strong sense of mission significance is one of the most powerful protective factors in isolated and confined environments. But those studies involve simulations that all participants know will end. The Mars crew would know, intellectually, that the mission would also end, but they would be facing uncertainties about when and whether the end would arrive that no simulation can replicate. The question of crew composition also has dimensions that receive less public attention than the engineering requirements. The mission would require, at minimum, someone with deep expertise in medicine and surgery, someone with advanced mechanical and electrical engineering skills capable of diagnosing and repairing complex systems across multiple domains, someone with scientific expertise in planetary geology or astrobiology, or some combination of both, someone with piloting and navigation skills. And all of these people would need to be psychologically suited to prolonged isolation, deeply committed to the mission, capable of functioning under extreme stress, and able to maintain effective interpersonal relationships for 3 years in a confined space. This combination of technical expertise, psychological resilience, and interpersonal compatibility makes the pool of genuinely viable candidates extremely small. Each person who meets all the criteria represents years of specialized training, personal sacrifice, and institutional investment. Sending them to Mars for 3 years removes them from their professional fields for that entire period. Some of the most qualified and capable people of their generation would be unavailable to their fields, their institutions, and their families for a duration that constitutes a significant fraction of a professional career. These are not arguments against the mission. They are dimensions of the mission's actual cost that deserve explicit acknowledgement. Because honestly, accounting for what a Mars mission requires is the only way to make informed decisions about whether and when to proceed. The orbital mechanics that govern when a Mars mission can launch and return are worth understanding in somewhat more detail because they explain why the commitment made at departure is so absolute. Earth and Mars follow different orbital paths around the Sun. Earth completes one orbit in roughly 365 days. Mars completes one orbit in roughly 687 days. Because they travel at different speeds, the geometry of their relative positions changes continuously. Periodically, roughly every 26 months, they reach a configuration called opposition, when Mars is on the same side of the Sun as Earth, and the distance between them is at or near its minimum. The best launch windows for a Mars mission correspond to periods when this geometry allows a spacecraft to travel from Earth to Mars using the least possible propellant, what mission planners call a Hohmann transfer orbit or a low-energy trajectory. These windows are narrow, typically lasting only weeks. A mission that misses its launch window must wait roughly 26 months for the next one. A crew on Mars must similarly wait for the next favorable geometry before beginning their return trip. This is why the surface stay is dictated to be approximately 500 days rather than some shorter or more flexible duration. The crew cannot simply leave when they are ready. They must leave when the planets are aligned correctly. This orbital constraint means that the decision to launch a Mars crew is not simply a decision to send them to Mars. It is also a decision that commits them to the full mission duration, including the surface stay, regardless of what happens after they leave Earth. An emergency on the surface cannot be resolved by early return, because early return, outside of specific narrow launch windows, requires prohibitive amounts of propellant that the mission architecture does not carry. The commitment is complete before the crew lands. Understanding this helps clarify why the first Mars mission would be qualitatively different from every previous human spaceflight in a way that goes beyond just being more difficult. In every previous mission, from the first Vostok flight through the present-day operations of the International Space Station, the crew has had the option, under sufficiently serious circumstances, of returning to Earth early. Abort modes and emergency return procedures have been built into every mission architecture precisely because maintaining that option is considered essential to crew safety and mission planning. The moral weight of sending human beings somewhere from which they cannot return early, even temporarily, even in an emergency, is fundamentally different from the moral weight of every spaceflight mission that came before. The Mars mission architects are acutely aware of this. The debate about whether to commit to a short-stay mission, which minimizes surface time but requires more propellant, versus a long-stay mission, which accepts the 500-day surface commitment in exchange for lower propellant requirements, has been ongoing in the mission planning community for decades, precisely because it involves this trade-off between flexibility and efficiency. Both architectures have serious constraints, but the long-stay architecture's complete elimination of emergency return capability represents a philosophical as well as an engineering departure from everything that has come before. What does it mean to send human beings somewhere knowing that no emergency can bring them home? The question has been asked in the mission planning literature, and it has been answered primarily in engineering terms. Design the systems to be reliable enough that the emergency does not occur. Make the crew self-sufficient enough that they can manage any emergency that does occur. Reduce the probability of catastrophic failure to an acceptably low level. These are the right engineering responses. They are not complete answers to the moral and psychological question. The question of what Mars changes about the human relationship to exploration is, at its deepest level, a question about the limits of what people can reasonably be asked to do in service of a goal, however important that goal might be. Exploration has always involved risk. It has always involved sacrifice. The people who sailed into unknown oceans in the 15 and 1600s accepted extraordinary risk in service of goals that were partly scientific, partly economic, and partly driven by the simple human compulsion to see what is on the other side of the horizon. Some of them died. Many of them never saw home again. The history of exploration is, in significant part, a history of people who crossed thresholds they could not cross back. What is different about Mars is the self-awareness. Those earlier explorers often did not fully know what they were getting into. The Mars crew would know precisely and in detail what the journey entails. They would have studied every risk and every uncertainty. They would have reviewed every analog study and mission architecture analysis and physiological research paper. They would board the spacecraft having chosen, with full information, to accept a separation from Earth so total and so extended that it cannot be fully compared to anything in the prior history of human experience. That choice, made with that level of knowledge, represents a genuinely new kind of human act. It is not heroism in the simple sense of charging into danger because you have been asked to. It is something more deliberate, a calculated acceptance of a transformation that the person making the choice fully understands they may not return from in any complete sense. The scientists and mission planners who will select that crew, train them, send them, and support them from 100 or more light seconds away will carry a weight of moral responsibility unlike anything in the history of human spaceflight. The responsibility not just to make the mission as safe as possible, but to be honest about what it costs, to ensure that the people who go understand fully what they are accepting, and to prepare as thoroughly as possible for the range of human experiences, physiological, psychological, relational, and existential, that the mission will produce. The answers that Mars will eventually provide are worth working toward. The confirmation or refutation of past or present life on Mars would be among the most consequential scientific discoveries in history. The knowledge of how human physiology and psychology respond to the conditions of an actual multi-year deep space mission would inform every subsequent step of human expansion beyond Earth. The technical capabilities demonstrated by a successful Mars mission would open possibilities for further exploration that are genuinely transformative. These are real and substantial reasons why the mission matters. They are reasons to pursue the mission honestly, with clear eyes about what it demands, rather than through the comfortable illusion that Mars is simply a harder version of something we have done before. The first humans on Mars will not be taking a longer trip. They will be crossing into a different category of human experience altogether. And the preparation for that crossing, the research, the technology development, the psychological understanding, the moral reckoning with what is being asked, deserves to be as complete and as honest as the engineering that will carry the rocket off the launch pad. The pale blue dot waiting in the Martian sky will be beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time. A reminder of everything that made the journey possible, and a measure of how far the journey has carried the people who made it. The distance between that dot and the boots pressing into Martian soil is not just the longest any human being has ever traveled from home. It is the first real test of whether a human being can carry home with them across a distance that makes home invisible and come back changed, but still fundamentally human. That is the question Mars will answer, and the answer is worth every year of work it takes to ask it properly. There is a moment in every serious examination of a Mars mission when the numbers stop being abstract and become personal. The moment when you stop calculating radiation doses in units of millisieverts and start thinking about what it means to accept a measurable increase in your lifetime cancer risk as the price of a journey. The moment when you stop measuring bone density loss in percentages per month and start thinking about what it means to return to Earth in a body that is weaker than the one you left in. The moment when you stop discussing communication delays in seconds and start thinking about what it means to tell someone you love something important, and then wait 22 minutes in silence for their face to tell you how they, received it. The science of Mars exploration requires both kinds of thinking. The precise, quantitative thinking that tells us exactly what conditions the crew would face, and the human thinking that asks what it means to face those conditions. Both are necessary. The first, without the second, produces mission plans that ignore what they cannot measure. The second, without the first, produces emotional responses that cannot be acted on. The challenge is to hold them together. This challenge shows up in the history of how Mars has been studied. The robotic exploration of Mars is one of the most successful scientific programs in the history of space exploration. Since the 1960s, a succession of orbiters, landers, and rovers have transformed our understanding of Mars from a neighboring point of light to a world we know in extraordinary detail. We have mapped its surface globally from orbit. We have analyzed the chemistry of its rocks and soil at dozens of sites. We have measured its atmospheric composition and pressure and temperature. We have found evidence of ancient river systems, lake beds, and possibly even an ancient ocean occupying much of the northern lowlands billions of years ago. We have detected methane in the atmosphere, a gas that could be produced by geological processes, or potentially by biological ones. We have found water ice near the poles and in subsurface deposits at mid-latitudes. We have established that Mars once had a magnetic field that protected its atmosphere, and that the loss of that field over billions of years led to the gradual stripping away of most of the original atmosphere by the solar wind. Each of these discoveries has built toward the central question that motivates so much of Mars science. Was Mars ever habitable? Did life arise there during the early period when conditions were warmer and wetter? Does anything live there now, perhaps in subsurface environments protected from radiation and extreme temperature swings? The answers to these questions are among the most consequential in all of science, not just for what they tell us about Mars, but for what they tell us about the prevalence of life in the universe. If life arose on Mars independently of life on Earth, it would tell us that life is not an extraordinary accident unique to one lucky planet, but rather a relatively robust outcome of the chemical processes that operate wherever conditions are sufficiently favorable. That implication, if confirmed, would fundamentally change how we think about the universe and our place in it. If Mars was habitable for billions of years and life never arose there, it would tell us something equally important about the rarity of the step from chemistry to biology. Either answer would be transformative. A crewed mission to Mars would not definitively answer these questions, but it would pursue them with a depth and flexibility that robots alone cannot provide. A geologist walking the ancient riverbeds of Mars, following a promising vein of sedimentary rock, collecting samples guided by expert judgment rather than pre-programmed protocols, can pursue scientific leads in ways that a rover operating on a 14-minute communication delay cannot. A biologist with direct access to a subsurface drilling site can make observations and adjustments in real time that would take weeks of back-and-forth communication to replicate remotely. The value of human presence on Mars for science is genuine and substantial. But the science cannot be separated from the costs, and the costs cannot be separated from the science in thinking about what a Mars mission is for and what it demands from the people who undertake it. The first crew to land on Mars would be doing science, yes. They would also be doing something else entirely, something that has no scientific category. They would be the first human beings to discover what it actually feels like to be that far from Earth. What they learn, not in their instruments, but in their bodies, in their minds, and their relationships, will be as important to every mission that follows as the geological data they gather. The question of what a human being can endure, not just physiologically, but psychologically, not just for days or weeks, but for years, on the far side of a communication delay that makes Earth functionally unreachable in real time, is not a question that can be answered any other way. It is worth thinking about what the crew would actually see when they looked at the Martian sky during those long surface days. The sky on Mars is not black, as it is in the vacuum of deep space. The thin atmosphere scatters sunlight, but differently from Earth. At midday, The sky is a pale pinkish tan, tinted by the fine dust suspended in the atmosphere. At sunrise and sunset, the colors reverse from what we are accustomed to on Earth. The sky near the horizon glows blue, while the rest of the sky fades toward its daytime pinkish tan. The sun appears smaller in the Martian sky than it does from Earth, about 2/3 the angular diameter, and correspondingly dimmer, delivering roughly 43% of the solar energy per unit area that reaches Earth's surface. The landscape would be dominated by red and brown tones, the characteristic colors of iron oxide compounds in Martian soil, broken by the gray-black of volcanic rocks, the occasional white of frost deposits, and the subtle textures of wind-shaped terrain. The horizon would be closer than on Earth because of Mars's smaller radius, giving the landscape a distinctive, contained quality. And on a clear night, looking up from inside a pressure suit in a Martian valley, the crew member would see a sky brilliant with stars, unclouded by light pollution, and would search it for the blue-white point of light that was home. That moment of searching, that need to find Earth in the Martian sky and to hold it there as a visible connection to everything left behind, would probably become one of the rituals of the surface stay. The way sailors once fixed their position by the stars, the crew would fix their psychological position by locating Earth. Not because seeing it as a dot provided any real comfort, but because the act of looking, the conscious acknowledgement of the distance and the direction, would be a way of maintaining the relationship between where they were and where they came from. The rituals of any isolated community serve partly this kind of function. They are ways of sustaining connection to something larger than the immediate circumstances. For communities separated from their origins, ritual often becomes more important over time rather than less, because it is one of the primary mechanisms through which identity is maintained across distance. The Mars crew would develop rituals, shared meals on specific occasions, commemorations of mission milestones, observances of Earth-time holidays as they passed, not because these rituals were functionally necessary, but because they were psychologically necessary. They would be the crew's way of saying, "We know where we come from, and we remember who we are." The crew would also develop new rituals, practices particular to life on Mars that had no precedent on Earth. The pre-EVA suit-up procedure, performed dozens of times across 500 days, would acquire the status of a ritual as familiar and as loaded with meaning as any ceremony on Earth. The daily check of atmospheric systems in the habitat, the review of surface weather forecasts before planning outdoor activities, the analysis of core samples in the geology laboratory. These activities would form the rhythm of Martian daily life, and that rhythm would become, over time, the rhythm the crew's bodies and minds were calibrated to. The rhythm of Earth, the 24-hour day, the weekly cycle, the seasons, would become something they experienced only through memory and through the messages arriving from home. The Martian day, the sol, lasts 24 hours and 37 minutes. That difference of 37 minutes does not sound significant, but over the course of a 500-day surface stay, it accumulates into weeks of offset from Earth time. If the crew kept Martian time, which would be the operationally sensible choice since everything on the surface operates on Martian lighting conditions, they would gradually drift out of alignment with their family's daily schedules back on Earth. A message sent from a crew member at the end of their Martian workday would arrive at a slightly different time each day, relative to the schedule of the family member on Earth. The synchronization of daily routines, already disrupted by the communication delay, would be further eroded by the simple difference in day length between the two worlds. These logistical details matter less than what they represent. Mars is not just far away. It is different. It operates on a different clock, under a different sun, in a different gravitational field, exposed to a different radiation environment. Living on Mars does not mean living in a place that happens to be far from Earth. It means living in a world that is genuinely alien in its daily rhythms and physical conditions. The crew would not just be maintaining a human enclave at a great distance. They would be adapting, necessarily and continuously, to a world that was not designed for them. This adaptation would be one of the most remarkable things about the mission, and also one of the least celebrated. The crew would be the first human beings to develop an embodied knowledge of what it is like to live on another world. Not as a visitor who passed through and returned, but as inhabitants who spent years in that environment and learned its textures and rhythms and demands. That knowledge cannot be transmitted in data files or written reports. It lives in the body and the mind of the person who accumulated it. The crew would carry it back to Earth as something unprecedented, a first-hand understanding of what human life on Mars is actually like. That embodied knowledge is one of the most valuable things the first Mars crew could return with, and it is also one of the most complete expressions of how irreversible the journey is. Knowledge gained from living on Mars cannot be ungained. The crew member who has spent 500 days learning how to move in a pressure suit on Martian terrain, who has internalized the rhythms of the Martian sol, who has adapted their sleep and work patterns to the specific conditions of a Martian habitat, carries a form of knowledge that makes them different from anyone who has not had those experiences. They are permanently the people who lived on Mars. That designation does not disappear when they return to Earth. It becomes part of who they are. This is not simply a matter of impressive credentials. It is a matter of identity. Human identity is partly constructed from the places we have lived, the experiences we have had, and the communities we have been part of. A person who spends 3 years in a radically alien environment with a small group of people who share experiences that no one else on Earth has had becomes someone whose identity is partly Martian in a way that cannot be fully revoked by returning to Earth. They came from Earth. They spent formative years on Mars. They will carry both in ways that may not always be easy to reconcile. The literature on exploration psychology includes studies of people who have spent extended periods in extreme environments and found, upon return, that reintegration is more complex than anticipated. Returning Antarctic expeditioners report a period of disorientation and difficulty reconnecting with the rhythms of ordinary life. Returning submariners describe an adjustment period during which the pace and noise and variety of surface life feels overwhelming. Returning soldiers describe a sense of alienation from people who have not shared their experiences. These are all cases involving terrestrial separations, recoverable in days or weeks. The Mars case involves a separation incomparably more total, more extended, and more physiologically and psychologically extreme. The crew who returns from Mars would need a reintegration process unlike anything that has been used for any previous astronaut recovery. Not just physical rehabilitation, which would itself be the most extensive in spaceflight history, but psychological support designed for people emerging from an experience without precedent. The institutional knowledge for how to support this process does not yet exist. It would need to be developed in real time, alongside the people who needed it. The broader public would also need to adjust its expectations of what returning Mars crew members would be like. There is a cultural template for the returning space hero: the press conference, the parade, the interview circuit, the inspirational speech. That template assumes the returning hero is fundamentally the same person who left, temporarily absent but now restored to their previous existence. The returning Mars crew would not fit that template. They would be people who had been irreversibly changed by an experience no one else had shared, returning to a world that had moved on without them, in bodies that had been altered by years of conditions that were not designed for human biology. The inspiration they would offer would be real, but it would be a different kind of inspiration than the public tends to expect. Not the inspiration of the triumph that has been completed and put behind, but the inspiration of people who have crossed into genuinely new territory, and are still, upon return, dealing with what that crossing means. That is a more complicated and more honest form of inspiration. It serves the goal of true understanding better than the simplified triumph narrative, and it is what the actual experience would produce. The preparation for a Mars mission is, in a meaningful sense, still in its early stages. The engineering challenges are well defined and being actively addressed. The physiological challenges are documented and being systematically studied. The psychological challenges are acknowledged and being researched. But the integration of all of these into a genuinely comprehensive understanding of what a Mars mission requires of the human beings who make it, and what it does to them, is an ongoing project that will not be complete before the first mission launches. What we can say, based on everything that has been studied and learned so far, is that the first humans on Mars will be making a journey unlike any that has been made before. Not just in its physical demands, or its engineering complexity, or its distance from Earth, but in what it asks of human psychology, human relationships, human identity, and human resilience. The people who go will be tested in ways that no training can fully prepare them for. The people who support them from Earth will be managing a mission under constraints of communication and distance that have no precedent in the history of human spaceflight. And the world that watches will be bearing witness to something genuinely new. The first human beings to live, even temporarily, beyond the sphere of ordinary human connection. The Earth will continue, as it always does, with its storms and its elections and its discoveries and its losses. And somewhere in the darkness between the planets, a handful of human beings will be looking at a pale blue dot in an alien sky, knowing everything that dot contains, and knowing what it means that they are here, and it is there, separated by a wall of light minutes, that no signal and no longing and no love can cross in anything less than the time it takes. That is the real weight of a Mars mission. Not the technical weight, which is enormous, but the human weight, which is heavier. The weight of knowing where you came from, and understanding, in a way that could not be understood before you left, exactly what it cost to come this far. The technology required for a Mars mission is worth examining not just in terms of what needs to be built, but in terms of what has already been learned from the robotic missions that preceded it. More than 50 spacecraft have been sent toward Mars since the 1960s. Roughly half of them failed, many in the early years when the technical challenges were less well understood. The ones that succeeded have produced a body of knowledge that makes a crewed mission conceivable in ways it was not a generation ago. The Viking landers, which touched down on Mars in 1976, conducted biology experiments designed to detect signs of life in the Martian soil. The results were ambiguous and have been debated for decades. The experiments detected chemical reactions in the soil that could be explained either by the presence of exotic oxidizing chemicals or by biological activity. The weight of scientific opinion has generally favored the chemical explanation, but the question has never been definitively resolved. The Viking experiments demonstrated that the Martian surface environment, highly oxidizing, intensely irradiated, and extremely dry, is challenging for the kind of life we know from Earth. But they did not settle whether Mars is sterile or merely hostile. The Mars Pathfinder mission in 1997 and its Sojourner rover demonstrated that a wheeled vehicle could operate on the Martian surface and conduct useful science. The Spirit and Opportunity rovers, which landed in 2004 and operated for years beyond their designed lifetimes, found compelling geological evidence for past liquid water at both landing sites. The Opportunity rover discovered hematite spherules called blueberries, formed in the presence of water, and explored ancient lake sediments that had once been soaked in liquid water for potentially thousands or millions of years. Spirit found silica deposits that could only have formed in hot springs or steam vents, environments potentially hospitable to microbial life. The Curiosity rover, which has been operating since 2012, was the first mission designed specifically to assess Mars's habitability. Its findings were remarkable. The landing site in Gale Crater contained lake sediments that preserved evidence of a freshwater environment with neutral pH, moderate salinity, and chemical gradients that would have provided energy for chemolithotrophic microorganisms, the kind of microbes on Earth that derive energy from chemical reactions rather than sunlight. The assessment was direct. If Mars had ever harbored life, Gale Crater was the kind of place it would have lived. Curiosity also detected organic molecules in Martian rocks, complex carbon-containing compounds that can be produced either by geological processes or by biological ones. The detection of organics does not prove that life existed on Mars, but it confirms that the chemical building blocks of life were present and are preserved in ancient Martian sediments. The mission also detected seasonal variations in methane concentration in the Martian atmosphere, a finding that has generated substantial scientific discussion because methane is rapidly destroyed by ultraviolet radiation on Mars and must be continuously replenished by some ongoing process. Whether that process is geological or biological remains unknown. The Perseverance rover, which landed in Jezero crater in 2021, is collecting rock core samples for eventual return to Earth. The crater was chosen because it preserves the remnants of an ancient river delta, a fan-shaped deposit of sediments carried into a lake by a river that flowed into the crater billions of years ago. River deltas on Earth are excellent places to find preserved organic material and biosignatures because they concentrate and trap material from a wide watershed. If Mars ever had life, the delta deposits in Jezero crater are among the most promising places to look for evidence of it. The Mars Sample Return Program, a joint project between NASA and the European Space Agency, is designed to bring Perseverance's rock cores back to Earth for analysis in terrestrial laboratories. The scientific logic is compelling. The most sensitive instruments for detecting signs of life are found in Earth laboratories, not in spacecraft. Bringing the samples home would allow them to be studied with techniques that cannot be miniaturized for a spacecraft, and to be reanalyzed as analytical methods improve over decades. If biosignatures are present in those samples, a terrestrial laboratory is more likely to find and characterize them than any instrument that could be landed on Mars. A crewed mission to Mars would operate in the context of everything these robotic predecessors have learned. The crew would arrive knowing where the most promising geological targets are, what chemical conditions prevail at their landing site, what the daily and seasonal variations in the Martian environment look like, and what the specific hazards of their landing region are. The robotic missions have been, in effect, a reconnaissance operation preparing the ground for human exploration. But preparation only goes so far. The surface of Mars is vast, approximately the same area as all the continents of Earth combined, and the robotic missions have explored only a tiny fraction of it. A crewed mission would be able to cover more terrain, respond to unexpected discoveries, and exercise the kind of flexible scientific judgment that is the unique contribution of human presence. A geologist who finds an interesting rock can examine it, tap it with a hammer, smell it, turn it over, hold it up to the light, make an immediate judgment about whether it warrants closer investigation, and decide on the spot whether to collect it for return to Earth. All of that takes seconds in the field. The equivalent sequence of operations with a Mars rover, including the communication delay, takes hours or days. This difference in operational tempo is not a luxury. It is the reason that human field geologists can accumulate knowledge in a day that would take a rover weeks to gather. And on a 500-day surface day, with a limited total distance that can be covered, the ability to work efficiently matters enormously for the scientific return on the mission. The candidate landing sites for a first crewed Mars mission would need to balance multiple requirements. Scientific interest, proximity to accessible subsurface water ice for in-situ resource utilization, elevation suitable for spacecraft landing and launch, terrain navigable by crew in pressure suits, and latitude low enough that solar power generation is reliable throughout the mission. These requirements do not always point to the same location. The most scientifically interesting sites, like the ancient lake deposits of Jezero crater, may not be the most operationally suitable. Mission planners would need to weigh scientific priority against operational safety in ways that involve difficult trade-offs. The physical experience of working on the Martian surface in a pressure suit is something that has never actually been experienced by a human being. Analog studies have been conducted in Mars suits on Earth, in the Antarctic, in the Arizona desert, and in the high Arctic, providing useful data about human performance in suit-constrained environments. But analogs on Earth can only approximate the real conditions. On Earth, if a suit develops a problem, you can remove it. On Mars, removing a suit means exposure to an atmosphere that is unbreathable and a pressure that is lethal within minutes. Every moment outside the habitat is a moment in which suit integrity is critical. The suits themselves would need to be far more capable and durable than any suit previously built for human spaceflight. Apollo suits were designed for short-duration use on the Moon, perhaps 2 hours at a time over a mission lasting less than 3 days on the surface. A Mars suit would need to withstand repeated use over 500 days, would need to provide adequate mobility for geological fieldwork and equipment maintenance, and would need to protect the wearer against the Martian cold, the radiation environment, and the abrasive Martian dust that would work its way into every joint and seal over months of use. Designing a suit that can sustain that level of use while maintaining its protective integrity across an entire surface mission is one of the significant engineering challenges of the program. The dust on Mars is a persistent concern that goes beyond the mechanical wear on suit joints. The fine-grained, electrostatically charged particles cling to suits, equipment, and habitat surfaces with tenacity. On the Apollo missions, lunar dust proved to be a significant operational problem in just 3 days, clogging equipment, abrading suit joints, and creating contamination problems inside the lunar module. Martian dust would present similar challenges over a much longer mission duration. Dust would accumulate on solar panels, reducing power generation. It would coat exterior sensors, degrading their performance. It would be tracked inside the habitat on boots and suit surfaces, despite airlock procedures designed to minimize contamination. During major dust storms, which can grow from regional to global scale over the course of weeks, the fine particles suspended in the atmosphere could reduce solar power generation so severely that the habitat's energy systems would be stressed. The 1977 global dust storm on Mars reduced solar irradiance at the surface by up to 99% at its peak. The Opportunity rover entered a months-long hibernation during the 2018 global dust storm when its solar panels could not generate sufficient power to maintain the rover's thermal systems. A crewed habitat caught in a comparable storm would face a genuine power crisis, and managing that crisis with the resources available on Mars, potentially including nuclear power systems, would be one of the scenarios that mission planners work to prepare for. The nuclear power option deserves mention because it illustrates the difference between robotic and crewed Mars operations. The Perseverance rover uses a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, a device that converts the heat from radioactive decay of plutonium-238 into electricity. This system provides reliable, continuous power regardless of solar conditions, which is one reason it was chosen for a mission that needed to operate through dust storms and polar nights. A crewed habitat would likely require a nuclear fission reactor capable of providing substantially more power than a radioisotope thermoelectric generator can produce. The Kilopower project, developed by NASA and the Department of Energy, demonstrated a small fission reactor design intended for exactly this purpose. Operating a nuclear fission reactor on the Martian surface, managing its waste heat, monitoring its performance, and ensuring its safety across a 500-day mission is a challenge that adds another layer of operational complexity to an already demanding mission profile. Water, that most fundamental of human needs, would be managed through a combination of imported supplies, recycling, and ideally in situ production from Martian resources. The presence of water ice in the Martian subsurface at many latitudes has been confirmed by multiple orbital measurements and has been directly observed at the surface in the northern polar regions. Drilling for subsurface ice and melting it for use would provide the most robust and sustainable water supply for a long-duration mission. The technical challenges of drilling in Martian soil, which may include hard rock, frozen regolith, and potentially layered ice deposits at varying depths, are being studied but have not been demonstrated at Mars under actual conditions. Food is another logistical challenge that receives less attention than it deserves. The mass required to transport sufficient food for a crew of 4 to 6 people for 2.5 to 3 years is enormous. Every kilogram launched from Earth multiplies in cost as it moves up the delta V ladder from Earth's surface to Mars' orbit. Growing food on Mars would reduce the required launch mass, but would require significant volume, water, and lighting resources inside the habitat. Early work on closed-loop food production systems, hydroponic and aeroponic cultivation methods, and the selection of crops most suitable for the Martian environment is ongoing. But feeding a crew on Mars from locally grown food, even partially, requires demonstrating that plants can be grown effectively under Martian conditions including the lower gravity and the different light spectrum and intensity over multi-year timescales. The oxygen situation is similar. The MOXIE experiment on Perseverance demonstrated that oxygen could be extracted from the Martian carbon dioxide atmosphere at a small scale. Scaling that technology up to the level required to supply a crewed habitat continuously over 500 days, while also providing oxygen for extravehicular activities and potentially for propellant production, is a major engineering undertaking. The principle is proven. The implementation at operational scale is not. All of these technical challenges point toward the same conclusion. A Mars mission requires not just a rocket and a habitat, but a miniature civilization. The crew would need to be capable of producing essential consumables from local resources, maintaining complex life support and power systems, conducting sophisticated science, managing their own health, and maintaining their psychological cohesion across years of isolation, all simultaneously, without external logistical support, and without the ability to call for help in any real-time sense. The combination of self-sufficiency and operational complexity required exceeds anything that has been demonstrated in the history of human spaceflight by a substantial margin. This does not mean the mission is impossible. It means the mission requires a level of preparation and demonstrated capability that is still years away from being fully in place. The robotic precursor missions that should precede a crewed landing, including demonstrations of in-situ oxygen and water production at scale, verification of ascent vehicle propellant production, and extended tests of habitat systems, have not yet been completed. The crewed lunar missions envisioned under the Artemis program are intended to develop and test many of the technologies and operational approaches that would be required for Mars. The path is being built, one step at a time. What remains constant throughout this process is the fundamental character of the destination. Mars is not becoming more forgiving as we learn more about it. The radiation environment is what it is. The communication delay is what the physics of distance dictates. The distance from Earth that makes emergency return impossible is a fact of celestial mechanics, not a correctable engineering deficiency. The psychological consequences of years of extreme isolation are not solved by better training programs, even though better training programs help. These are inherent features of the destination, and they will be faced by the first crew regardless of how well prepared they are. The people who eventually land on Mars will have benefited from everything that their predecessors learned, in spacecraft and in analog environments and in laboratory studies and in mission planning simulations. They will be as prepared as it is possible to be for a journey that cannot be fully prepared for. They will carry the accumulated knowledge of everyone who contributed to making the mission possible, and they will cross a threshold that none of that preparation can describe from the inside. The threshold of actually being there, actually seeing Earth as a dot in an alien sky, actually listening to a voice from home, arriving 11 or 22 minutes after it was spoken, actually waking up each morning on a world that was not designed for them, and choosing, again, to do the work that the mission requires. That choice, repeated across 1,000 mornings, is what a Mars mission actually is. Not the launch or the landing, which are single moments, however dramatic. Not the flag planting or the first footstep, which are symbols, however meaningful. The mission is the 1,000 mornings, the 1,000 sols. The accumulated daily decisions to keep going, to keep maintaining the systems that keep you alive, to keep doing the science, to keep sending the messages home, even when the home they describe has become something you hold in memory rather than in daily experience. That is the reality. The engineering and the mission plans and the press conferences and the inspirational speeches are all ultimately in service of making it possible for human beings to face those 1,000 mornings and come back, changed but intact, carrying with them the knowledge of what it costs to go and what it means to return. The scientific and exploratory value of that journey is real and substantial. The cost of it, in human terms, is also real and substantial. Both deserve to be held clearly in mind as the day approaches when a crew will stand at the base of a rocket, look up at the sky, and prepare to leave Earth behind in the deepest sense that phrase has ever carried. There is one more dimension of the Mars mission that deserves examination. And it is the dimension that connects the individual human experience of the journey to its larger meaning for the species. Every act of exploration in human history has been, among other things, an act of self-definition. When human beings choose to go somewhere new, they reveal something about what they are and what they value. The decision to go to Mars, and the acceptance of everything that decision entails, tells us something important about what kind of species we are becoming. The exploration of Earth's oceans, its continents, its polar regions, its ocean depths, and ultimately its orbit and the surface of the Moon has been a continuous project of self-extension. We have always been drawn toward the horizon and beyond it. This compulsion is not merely the product of economic incentives or national competition, though both of those have played roles. It seems to reflect something deeper, a restlessness, a curiosity, a refusal to accept any given boundary as permanent. Every generation has found the outer limit of human presence and decided to push it further. Mars represents the next extension of that limit, not the last one. If humanity establishes a sustained presence on Mars, the next frontier will be the asteroid belt, and then the moons of Jupiter, and then further still. Each step requires accepting costs that the previous generation did not face, because each step carries human beings into conditions that are more challenging, more remote, and more irrevocably far from the world that made us. The step to Mars is larger than any previous step, but in the long arc of human expansion, it is one step among many. What makes this particular step historically significant is not just the distance, but the combination of distance and awareness. The first humans to reach Mars will know what they are doing and what it costs in a way that earlier explorers often did not. They will have read the research. They will have studied the physiology. They will have spoken with psychologists and mission planners and space medicine specialists. They will have trained for years under conditions designed to approximate the challenges they will face. They will board the spacecraft with a clearer understanding of what they are accepting than any explorer in history has had. And then, in the face of that understanding, they will go anyway. That is the thing that is worth noting, not as an act of reckless courage, but as an act of deliberate choice made by people who know what the choice means. The willingness to accept a transformation you cannot fully predict, in service of a goal you believe is worth the cost, is one of the defining qualities of human aspiration at its most serious. The Mars crew will be, among other things, proof that this quality persists, that the species that chose to push into unknown oceans in fragile wooden ships, that chose to attempt the poles in conditions that killed many of those who tried, that chose to break the sound barrier and orbit Earth and walk on the Moon, has not lost its appetite for the horizon, that the accumulation of knowledge about the risks ahead does not extinguish the willingness to face them, but refines it into something more deliberate and more profound. The scientific returns on a Mars mission are not the primary reason to value it, though they are real and important. The primary reason to value it is what it demonstrates about the kind of beings who are willing to make the journey. Beings who can hold the full weight of what they are accepting, the physiological toll, the psychological cost, the relational sacrifice, the irreversibility of the change they will undergo and choose to go. Not because the alternative is worse, but because the goal is worth the cost. That choice, made by a handful of people on behalf of a species, is the thing that will be remembered about the first Mars mission long after the specific scientific findings have been absorbed into the textbooks. Not just what they found, but that they went. Not just what they accomplished, but what they accepted in order to accomplish it. Not just the achievement, but the human beings who carried it. The pale blue dot will still be there when they arrive, smaller than they expected, more beautiful and more heartbreaking than any photograph prepared them for, impossibly distant and impossibly precious. The entire known history of their species reduced to a point of light they can cover with a fingertip. And in that moment, whatever else Mars means, and whatever else the mission delivers, it will mean this: that we came from there, and we chose to come here, and we knew what that choice would cost, and we came anyway. That is the truth of a Mars mission. That is what the engineering is ultimately in service of. That is why the distance matters, and why the cost matters, and why it is worth understanding, both honestly and completely, before the day arrives, when the rocket ignites and the first humans begin the long crossing toward the place that will, for 1,000 days, be the furthest any member of our species has ever been from home.